Hello, my name's Gian Luis Hernandez. Thank you for watching my presentation on my paper entitled Not Our Students, Exploring the International University as a Site of Negotiating Race, Ethnicity, and Nationality. So this paper is on students and administrators at Swiss universities. The title itself comes from an interesting differentiation between whose students are ours in the eyes of a particular administrator that I interviewed and whose students are not, so not ours. And she kind of differentiated between international students who are registered at the university as full-time students being not ours, which I thought was very interesting because the students for which she was responsible were kind of more under her purview. She kind of saw them more as like her responsibility, and I just found this delineation quite interesting. The data from the paper comes from 22 qualitative interviews with international and domestic students, as well as from 5 administrators from universities in the 3 linguistic regions of Switzerland. For those of you that might not be familiar with Switzerland, it's comprised of a French-speaking, a Swiss-German-speaking, and an Italian-speaking region. This is the second paper of my cumulative PhD dissertation, and we're attempting to publish it in a special issue on critical internationalization. So issues of critical internationalization come up within the theme of the paper. For a little bit of context, within internationalization studies, there isn't necessarily a huge emphasis on race and ethnicity. A lot of the kind of dynamics that get described are more related to nationality. And so this idea around race and ethnicity being sort of having sort of a lack is quite prevalent within the bodies of work that I'm looking at. And also there tends to be a lack of research outside of the US or Anglophone contexts more generally. So what we see is studies focusing on US American students going abroad, or studies on international students coming to the United States. And so those are quite prevalent within the field. What we do see a little bit of branching out in is towards Anglophone context. So we kind of see, studies looking at Canada, the UK, and Australia. But again, these are much kind of centered around either the US or the Anglophone contexts. And because I'm looking at race and ethnicity, I was interested in gaining insight on those dynamics, and affect theory kind of really showed up as a way to get at that. I was looking at a lot of different theories, and this is just kind of what showed up, and that's why I did that. Now, for the lit review, I go into within the paper, I go into the implications of a lot of theories of definitions. But what I'm going to do now is just kind of give a broad overview of the definitions that I'm using. So, international students are students who have crossed the national or territorial border for the purpose of education and are now enrolled outside their country of origin. This is just a basic definition, but also realizing that the international student as a category is culturally contingent. So this is important, especially when thinking about dynamics of difference that change categorically based on the context in which a student finds themselves. Like I said before, I'm interested in race, ethnicity, and nationality, and it's important for me to have a clear definition so that I can operationalize the theory through the same way throughout all of my thinking. For me, I'm going with David Theo Goldberg's definition of race, which is taken historically as identifying people geomorphically by their supposed phenotypes in terms of their imputed or implied geographic origin, and the cultural characteristics considered to be associated with those geographic identifications, those landscapes, and their associated characteristics. So basically, this is saying identifying people based on how they look and associating those looks in terms of where one might think they come from, and where they might think that their origins might be. And of course, also identifying them based on those geographic identifications. So this definition brings in the kind of visual analysis of race, but also the kind of discursive and semiotic construction that we have that's associated with interpreting somebody's racialized things, let's say. Of course, when talking about race, especially in the English context, often the question arises, and this is something that I'm thinking of in terms of presupposing or preempting reviewer questions. What about ethnicity? Some people, especially also in the data, will conflate the two, and for me, it's very important to maintain them as distinct. And so for me, I'm going with ethnicity as a salient basis for group identity formation that is self-defined, adaptable, and embedded in notions of kinship, culture, and shared history. I'm going to speak a little bit to that debate between sort of differentiating between race and ethnicity with this project. And for me, that's just an important aspect to maintain. Of course, with international students, the underlying logic or the underlying kind of dynamic that maintains its importance is nationality. We talk about international students moving across national borders. Like nationality is kind of the organizational sort of context. And this definition kind of encompasses that, coming from a communications scholar, Crofts Wiley, a powerful logic of spatial and cultural organization. It becomes a shorthand for particular political experiences and is then articulated as as part of the aforementioned dynamics of difference, right? So nationality becomes a way to talk about race without actually talking about race. And this is something that emerged in the data, but I needed to kind of have the theoretical framework there in order to talk about it. Now, as I said, I was looking into how to talk about race, ethnicity, and nationality, and the thing that emerged as a useful methodological tool was affect theory. I understand affect in the sense of Margaret Wetherell, who says that affect is embodied meaning making, meaning it's dependent upon specific practices that converge to create specific constellations and behaviors, psychological processes, feelings, narratives, and other discursive and material constructs. So when it comes to affect, one cannot talk about affect without embodiment, right? And the following definition really links those two intimately, right? So the body is constructed based on its capacity to affect and be affected, meaning that one cannot talk about affect without talking about embodiment, and one cannot talk about embodiment without talking about affect. So these two things are interwoven, and that for me is very important to remember. When it comes to methodology, I'm borrowing from a number of sources. I view the interview as a situated affective encounter, which means that the relationship between the interviewer and the interlocutor is dynamic and shaped by different relational intensities. This brings the interview back into focus, as what I'm seeing in the literature is that the interview is kind of reduced simply to the transcript, and the text is then analyzed on that basis. But what I'm wanting to do, especially after having conducted these interviews, is really center the relationship and the interaction between myself and my interview partner in order to kind of tease out what differing embodiments arise and how affect sort of shapes the experiences that they describe, but also their experience kind of in general. In terms of the nuts and bolts of methods, to get more specific from methodology, I'm using narrative analysis, which, drawing from literary studies, is concerned with the teller as well as the tale. So for me, that's interesting because the teller of the tale is this embodied human, and I'm wanting to kind of use the analysis to get at what the teller who the teller is, who the narrators of these narratives are. And that means looking at the lexical, syntactic, and prosodic levels of the text to explore emotional expressions. Now, these are very preliminary findings. I've been analyzing these for the past few weeks now, or a few days now, and it's whatever. So essentially, I had this idea of difficult embodiment. Drawing back on within the theoretical framework that I've set up, the interview is a situated affective encounter, which means that affect is ever present. So the discursive and material implications of emotional expression are kind of always there, always already present. But not only in the expression, but also in the analysis. This presents some difficulties because how do I get at affect if it's precognitive, meaning outside of language? There were a number of interviews where I asked the questions about embodied emotions and I received blank stares. But of course, after reformulating, I did get some interesting data. For example, students would kind of report that they have this one student, sometimes when I'm feeling I don't have any friends here or at all, I do feel in my body that sometimes I will be like, I don't even feel like waking up. And this impacted me also in the interview, right? It was a very impactful thing to say. And I think that I'm wanting to tease out a little bit more about how affect structures this person's experience as an international student. So that's what I need to say about that. But I also wanted to kind of hint at, especially within affect research, it's not always about the negative, because I think a lot of the emotion research is really structured on trauma, and I mean, what the concept that I'm borrowing, difficult embodiment from difficult knowledge, is really about trauma and violence and grief and all of these sorts of things. And so I do want to bring into the idea that positive emotions are equally structuring, right? And so this, in the second example, this person spoke of their burdens being lifted, and this is being a very effective experience. And so I kind of wanted to touch on that within my findings. One way to get at the like how to describe affect is noticing how students are expressing themselves. So gesture and onomatopoeia came up. So because these are not necessarily linguistic or verbally linguistic ways of expression, and it often showed up as kind of what students are doing with their bodies in order to express their emotion. I found this quite interesting. Especially in relation to kind of collectivities, right? So this person is from Uganda, and she met a person from Congo, and she immediately started, when describing this interaction, started laughing and made an excited sort of flailing hand gesture, and that was the emotion. It was excited, it was hopeful, it was complex. And this feeling of where should I start, right? She says it's like a happy feeling, obviously, but trying to ask yourself questions, you say, okay, and then she makes the gesture again, where do I start? Like if you have a lot of questions and you would love to ask, so yes. And this is interesting because it hints at this the difficulty of expressing one's emotions, and using the body as a way to get around, or a way to circumvent sort of the limits of language, as it were. So in moving from the sort of micro interaction into the kind of macro level focus that I wanted to get in terms of looking at dynamics of difference, one thing specifically when talking about how students are using their bodies and what is going on with students embodying themselves in different contexts. I think that's where the study realizes its value, because we have these emotional expressions which can be very descriptive, but then also linking them to kind of broader flows, and sort of looking at like larger contexts. I have two examples. In one, a white passing American male met a neo-Nazi, and he was saying that because he was part Jewish, he didn't necessarily want to bring that up to this anti-Semitic person. He was shocked and surprised, but his white passing kind of offered this sort of protection. And so I found this quite interesting because a lot of the theorizing around whiteness positions it as, for example, a present absence or a cloak, or sort of in the larger context of race as a floating signifier. But this shield, this idea that his whiteness presented itself in a way to kind of shield him from this dynamic in the international context was quite interesting. And then another example of this idea that it's not something that one can easily navigate, right? So this is why I say that it's heavy, because this person said, if I don't say a word, I guess I could be Swiss if you look at me. And this emerged often, right? People were talking about the ways that they looked versus how they present themselves. And I kind of am still sussing out exactly what I want to say around this idea, but these two examples just sort of showed something interesting about how race specifically is embodied. So for the next steps, I just need to refine the codes. I need to continue with the analysis and pay attention to the submission deadline, which is August 31st. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.